In a small, cozy house nestled at the end of a quiet, suburban street, night had fallen unnoticed. The gentle breeze of April blew softly through the slightly ajar window, carrying with it the scent of fresh grass and damp earth from the afternoon rain. Everything seemed to be drifting into a peaceful sleep. The living room lights were off, the TV in the bedroom had stopped, leaving only the slow ticking of the wall clock and the faint yellow glow of the nightlight filtering down the hallway. David yawned widely, placing his hand on Emily's belly as a habit. His wife was 8 months pregnant, her round belly now obvious, but she still managed to smile gently despite her exhaustion from the day. She had just checked on their 9-year-old son, John. She tucked the thin blanket back over him after it had been kicked off in his sleep, then turned off the light and gently closed the door behind him. Everything seemed calm, serene. But at the exact moment David's hand rested on the bedroom door handle, a soft sound emerged from behind him, like a faint groan blending into the stillness of the air. Woof! Another sound followed, this time clearer, like a call, but weak and full of urgency. David turned his head. Murphy, the family's old dog, was sitting there at the end of the hallway, where he usually curled up to sleep. But tonight, he wasn't sleeping. Murphy stood up with difficulty, his back legs trembling, his tail drooping. He walked slowly toward David, nudging his sleeve with a shaky paw. His eyes, clouded with age, stared up at him intensely, as if trying to communicate something, as though pleading for something more important than food or the familiar patting. David sighed, bending down to give Murphy's head a quick rub. "What's wrong? Still not asleep at this hour?" Murphy didn't wag his tail like he usually did. He turned his head, glancing towards the kitchen, then back at David. He didn't bark, only let out another quiet whimper before suddenly turning around, stumbling back toward the kitchen as if to lead the way. David paused for a moment. He felt something odd in Murphy's behavior, but shrugged it off, thinking the old dog was just having one of his senile moments again. Lately, Murphy had been standing motionless in the yard or growling at his own shadow on the floor, leading the family to believe that age had dulled his once sharp instincts. David stepped into the room and shut the door behind him. Behind him, Murphy's claws scratched softly against the wood. It wasn't loud nor persistent, but steady and filled with a quiet urgency. "Not again." Emily opened her eyes, her voice tired. "Murphy?" "Yeah, just trying to get attention. Probably thinks we've abandoned him," David replied, not bothering to look back. Emily turned towards the inside, her hand resting lightly on her belly. "I feel sorry for him, but he's been acting weird lately. Maybe he really is losing it." Outside, Murphy still sat there. No one came to open the door, no gaze met his, and no hand came to stroke his back, now covered with graying fur. Yet, he didn't leave. He sat down, struggled to stand again, then limped back toward the bedroom door, only to turn and make his way to the kitchen once more. He sniffed every corner, moving slowly with an unsteady gait. His drooping ears twitched as he caught sounds that only he could hear. Vague whispers in the air, faint movements beneath the old wooden floorboards. Murphy didn't understand everything, but there was one thing he knew. Something was wrong in the house. Something was making it impossible for him to lie still like he did every other night. The instinct that once helped him save a life, the instinct of a working dog, hadn't disappeared. It had just been forgotten. He nudged the door again, letting out a soft bark, almost choking in his throat. No one answered. Inside the warm room, David had drifted off to sleep. Emily was also asleep, her hand still resting on her belly, her breathing steady. Outside, the wind began to pick up, clouds drifting slowly across the moon, casting shadows over the roof tiles. And Murphy, the old dog, still stood there in the dark, silent, solitary, and determined. Murphy continued to gently scratch at the bedroom door, his claws tapping in a steady rhythm like the ticking of an invisible clock, counting down to something only he could feel. Occasionally, he would let out a soft bark, as if afraid of making too much noise, yet unable to stay silent. His cloudy eyes were still fixed on the hallway, where a strange scent began to linger in the air. Inside the bedroom, David shifted for the third time, unsettled in his sleep. He opened his eyes and glanced towards the door. The scratching sound resumed, rhythmic, persistent, unrelenting. Sighing, he sat up, muttering something indistinct. "Can't let anyone sleep, can he?" He opened the door. Murphy immediately stood up, albeit unsteadily, and turned towards the kitchen, lifting his front paw as if urging David to follow. David looked at him, ready to scold, but then his nose twitched. Something wasn't right. A strong, acrid odor seeped through the hallway, a sharp, unmistakable smell of burning. He frowned and hurried after Murphy. The closer he got to the kitchen, the stronger the scent became, making his throat tighten uncomfortably. As he pushed open the door, David froze. In the corner where the kitchen's main power socket was located, a flickering light flashed between the shadows. Small sparks were sputtering from a socket connected to the kettle. The fire darted like the tongue of a snake, and the wooden floor beneath the socket had darkened, beginning to smoke. David's heart skipped a beat. "Emily!" he yelled, his voice full of urgency. Emily immediately jolted awake, still groggy from sleep. She instinctively grabbed her belly and dashed out of the room, barefoot, her eyes wide with panic. When she reached the kitchen, she saw David frantically unplugging the kettle and dabbing a wet cloth onto the wall near the sparks. She stood frozen, shocked. Murphy stood between them, growling softly, his eyes never leaving the power socket. Emily gripped the back of a chair, whispering, "Oh my God!" After a tense few minutes, everything was finally extinguished. The socket was scorched, the surrounding wood charred, leaving a long black streak. The scent of smoke still hung in the air, lingering in their hair, on their sleeves, and even in their breath. David stood up straight, sweat beading at his temples. He looked back at what had just happened. It had been so close. If they had been a few minutes later, the sparks might have caught the nearby curtains, or spread to the dry wooden floor of the kitchen. And then, just a little longer, he sighed, his hand pressing against his knee. We almost... Emily, still in shock, kept her gaze on Murphy. He stood there, head raised, his expression almost asking, "Do you believe me now?" She knelt down, gently embracing Murphy, her hand patting his thin back. "Thank you, Murphy. Thank you for not giving up." Murphy gave a soft wag of his tail, bowing his head into her hand, silent, not demanding, not urging. He simply stood there, as if what he had just done was the most natural thing in the world, as it had been for years, quietly watching over the family he considered his everything. John, hearing the commotion, ran out, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "What happened?" he asked, then froze when he saw the scorch marks on the wall. But what really made John stop in his tracks was Murphy, still standing tall like a sentry, his stance unchanged since the last time John used to cuddle him to sleep. David sat down on the chair, exhaling deeply. His gaze lingered on Murphy before turning to Emily, who sat beside him, her hand still resting on her belly. "Probably just luck," he said, trying to reassure himself. "After all, he's getting old." Emily didn't respond. She looked at David, then at Murphy, a strange feeling stirring within her. There was something in Murphy's eyes that made her unable to look away. A quiet sadness, a silent trust, an unspoken message. "I'm still here, always a part of this home." Murphy didn't expect applause, didn't need praise. He only wanted to be beside them, even though the adults no longer sought him out as they once did, even though John no longer slept beside him, even though sometimes he was treated like an old shadow. Murphy remained, and he always would. That night, after the family returned to their rooms following the ordeal, Murphy remained sitting in front of the kitchen door, keeping watch for a long time. When everything finally quieted down, he turned back to his old mat by the back door, curled up but with his ears still perked, ready to listen for any small noise in the dark. And as the family slept soundly, No one noticed that it was the old dog, the one they thought was useless, who had kept them safe from a danger no one had expected. The kitchen was bathed in the bright glow of emergency lights, the smell of burning plastic still lingering in the air. But after the electrician arrived to inspect the outlet and confirmed that the danger had passed, everything seemed to return to its usual rhythm. Emily busied herself cleaning up the scene. David did one last check on all the appliances in the house before heading back to the bedroom, and John had long since fallen asleep in his room. As for Murphy, the old dog who had just saved the family from a fire, he returned to his thin rug by the porch, curling up quietly as if nothing had happened. No one stopped to look at Murphy for long. No one thought to call him inside to lie closer, to be warmer. David did bend down to give Murphy's head a quick pat, but it was more out of habit than anything, and he walked away. Emily, as she passed by, whispered, "Good boy, Murphy," but her eyes were already focused on the laundry machine and the unfinished chores. No one noticed that, even though it was still a chilly April night, Murphy's thinning, dry coat was trembling lightly with each passing gust of wind. Murphy wasn't a purebred, expensive dog. He had been adopted by the family from a small shelter on the outskirts of the city on John's 2nd birthday. That day, David took John to visit the fluffy friends as a special activity. They had no intention of bringing anyone home, simply viewing it as an experience. But everything changed when Murphy, who at the time was just a grown dog with big ears, a tangled brown coat, and a nose that was always sniffing with curiosity, locked eyes with John. David still remembered that gaze, the way Murphy looked up through the bars of his cage, not scratching, not barking, but staring intently as if to say, "I know I belong with you." Emily had laughed when Murphy was first taken out of the shelter. It's like he knows today is his big day. And it was. Murphy became the soul of the home. The 3-member family would call him the bravest guard dog, and saw him as an indispensable part of everything they did. Murphy became John's best friend. He played with John everywhere, rolling around in the yard, lying down listening to the boys' silly stories about his classmates, and whenever strangers came to the house, Murphy was always the first to step forward, standing guard at the door, wagging his tail, but his eyes still cautious. There was one time when John fell off his bike and scraped his knee. Murphy immediately ran to find Emily, tugging at her sleeve until she followed him outside. She exclaimed, "Oh my God, Murphy, you're amazing! It's like you understand everything!" During family picnics, Murphy always had a spot on the back seat of the car, and his own portion of grilled meat. In birthday photos, in Christmas pictures, Murphy was always at the center, wearing a red bow tie, proudly sitting among his loved ones. Under the familiar porch, once the joyful gathering spot for the whole family every afternoon, Murphy had become nothing more than a silent shadow. The old rug, once where John and Murphy lay together reading, now bore the imprint of the old dog curled up in it. The May sun had begun to shine, its beams flickering through the branches, casting shadows across the yard. But Murphy no longer chased his own shadow like he used to. He simply sat there, his cloudy eyes watching through the window, where life inside the house continued. No longer for him. John was now 9 years old. Once the boy who clung to Murphy's tail all day, sharing snacks and chatting with him like his closest friend, he was now engrossed in the tablet he had received for his birthday. Every afternoon, John lay on the sofa, eyes glued to the screen, smiling to himself at animated characters or video games. Sometimes Murphy would quietly approach, slowly placing his head on the boy's legs, hoping for a familiar pat on the head. But John would usually just shift his leg aside, furrowing his brow slightly, saying, "Murphy's fur itches my legs." It wasn't that John didn't love Murphy anymore. It was simply that he had been swept into a new world, a world with no room for a slow, aging dog. David, on the other hand, was more practical. He didn't enjoy inconveniences. As the breadwinner of the family, he was always busy with work, calls, and recently, preparations for the new baby. Every time he hurried out the door, He'd sigh when almost tripping over Murphy lying in the hallway. "Why do you always have to lie in the way like this, Murphy?" It wasn't a scolding, but a mild complaint repeated too often. Once, Murphy tried to stand up to move, but his weak legs wobbled, knocking into David's desk and sending a stack of papers flying. David wasn't angry. He just shook his head in exasperation and bent down to collect the papers with a fleeting, sad look. But then he quietly pushed Murphy aside. Not a word of affection spoken. Emily, who once used to sleep with Murphy by her side during her early pregnancy because his presence made her feel safe, was now more tired than ever. She was in the final month of her pregnancy, her back aching, her legs swollen, and the occasional cramps leaving her exhausted. Every time she walked down the hallway and saw Murphy's fur scattered across the wooden floor, she would frown. "I'll probably have to vacuum twice a day because of Murphy's fur." It wasn't that she didn't care about Murphy. Emily still often paused to stroke his back when she poured herself some water, and occasionally whispered, "You're getting old, my friend." But it all stopped there. More a feeling of sympathy than love, more of a habit than genuine affection. No one hated Murphy. They still kept him in the house, still fed him on time, still called his name when they needed to take him out to the yard. But love was no longer the blazing fire it once was. Now, it was the faint warmth of a distant memory. They kept Murphy not for the present, but for the past. After all, everyone had said, he's been part of this family for so many years. And Murphy, though no longer able to jump up in joy as he once did, still tried. He didn't complain, didn't leave, didn't grumble. Every morning he still waited by the kitchen door as Emily prepared breakfast. Though he no longer got to sneak a piece of sausage like before, Murphy still waited, his eyes asking, "Is there something for me today?" As John played in the backyard, Murphy slowly followed him, lying a few meters away, occasionally lifting his head to check if John had fallen or gotten stung by a bee. One afternoon, Murphy heard a loud noise from the bathroom, thinking John had slipped. The old dog rushed in as fast as he could, but only caused David to almost trip over him. David frowned. "Murphy, you don't need to do that anymore. You're not as quick as you used to be." Murphy stood still, panting. But the next day, he did the same thing again. Because Murphy didn't know any other way to show love other than by always being there, always ready, even though his body was weary. At times, Murphy would try to step up the porch steps to sit with the family in the living room. But the steps were too high, and his legs were too weak. After several failed attempts, he gave up. Instead, Murphy sat on the porch, his eyes following through the glass window, watching John laugh, Emily prepare tea, David read the newspaper. Just watching them, Murphy felt happy. One afternoon the sky turned gray, and rain poured down cold and fast, drumming loudly against the metal roof. On the porch, Murphy still lay motionless, not bothering to retreat to a dry spot. The rain began to splash in, soaking into his thinning and dry fur on his old back. From the living room, John looked up from his tablet, peering out the window, frowning. "Mom, Murphy's still out there." Emily, who had been folding baby clothes for Lily, glanced outside and sighed. She pulled the curtain slightly, mumbling not really to anyone. "It's raining, and he won't even come inside. He's old now, probably doesn't even realize anymore." David, who was adjusting the towel rack in the bathroom, froze at the sound. He put down the screwdriver, wiped his hands, and walked out to the back door, his eyes following the porch. Through the blurry rain, he saw Murphy still curled up, his humped back soaked, but there was no sign of fear or trying to escape the rain. He just lay there, his head resting on his front legs, his eyes staring at the empty yard in the rain, as if seeing something far away. David opened the door, stepping out into the rain. The drops hit his shoulder. He bent down and patted Murphy's side. "Come on, you can't stay in the rain." Murphy didn't react immediately, as if hesitating. Then he looked up at David, his cloudy eyes lighting up with a nostalgic glint. That strange light humans sometimes can't explain. David gently tugged on Murphy's collar and led him inside, leaving a small puddle of water spreading on the wooden floor behind him. While David rummaged for a towel to dry Murphy, the dog remained silent, not barking, not moving. Because in Murphy's heart, the rain was more than just rain. It was a memory. It was those old days when John was little, running around in the rain with him. The boy would grab Murphy's ears, laughing and shouting, "Murphy, race me, let's see who runs faster." And Murphy would bark joyfully, chasing the splashes of water, his eyes sparkling with excitement. In Murphy's heart, that house was still the whole world. Even though that world was slowly turning its back on him, Murphy chose to stay, like a loyal shadow. Because for Murphy, every laugh, every step of the people he loved, was the heartbeat that kept this old heart beating on. Murphy had grown accustomed to the feeling of being sidelined. For many days, he simply lay quietly on the porch or by the doorframe, observing the world inside the house like a silent spectator. But that morning, something unusual crept into every corner of the small home. The phone rang urgently from the bedroom, followed by the sound of slippers shuffling, the door slamming shut, and the rush of a car engine starting quickly in the yard. Murphy lifted himself up, slowly walking to the edge of the yard, where he saw David hurriedly fastening the seatbelt for Emily, his heavily pregnant wife, her face pale with a mix of emotion and exhaustion. John stood silently on the doorstep, clutching an old teddy bear tightly. David turned his head, his voice trembling lightly. "John, stay here and watch the house. I'm taking your mom to the hospital. You're going to be a big brother." The car door slammed shut. In an instant, it was just John and Murphy standing on the doorstep, watching the car speed off down the road, leaving behind a thin trail of dust and the cold, whispering wind. That afternoon, the house seemed to hold its breath. John didn't say much, only sitting in the corner of the living room, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the landline phone. He wasn't too young to understand what was happening, but he wasn't yet old enough to fully grasp the sacredness of what was to come. Murphy lay by his feet, the old head gently resting against John's knee, as if to share in the unspoken waiting. Late into the night, the phone rang. John jumped up and shouted, "It's here! It's here, Murphy!" David's voice came through the receiver, filled with joy and relief. "It's a girl, John. She's healthy. Your mom's okay. You're a big brother now." Emily had given birth 2 weeks earlier than expected, but everything went smoothly. Lily was born on a rainy afternoon, smaller than expected, but her cry filled the delivery room. The next day, Emily and Lily were brought home, cradled gently in David's arms. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sharp cry of the tiny newborn filled the once quiet house, bringing with it a new, sacred emotion, overwhelming and yet filled with wonder. John was called over to stand by the crib. His wide eyes were filled with confusion as he gazed at the tiny being wrapped in soft blankets. David bent down, patting John's shoulder. "You're a big brother now. Can you protect your little sister from now on?" John didn't answer, merely nodding. In his eyes there was both curiosity and a trace of caution. Murphy stood a few steps away, his head tilted slightly, his ears drooping. A few days later, the house was louder than it had ever been. Paper towels, bottles, diapers were scattered everywhere. Emily was tired but happy, and David was busy juggling work and learning how to change diapers. Lily cried through the night, her loud cries forcing the family to learn how to sleep in shifts. Everyone was exhausted, but everyone was smiling. But Murphy, no one mentioned him. During those busy first days, Murphy simply existed as a silent presence at the edges of the chaos. No one told Murphy to go into the baby's room, nor did anyone remind him to find a new spot to rest. Only David, one morning as he passed through the hallway, frowned and turned to Emily. "I think it's best if we don't let Murphy into Lily's room. He sheds a lot of fur. If she breathes it in, it'll be bad for her." At that moment, Emily was soothing Lily to sleep, her eyes heavy with dark circles from sleepless nights. Since that day, the door to the baby's room was always closed. No matter how slow Murphy had become, he understood the signals. He didn't growl or protest. He simply changed his spot, from the corner of the house where the morning sun used to shine, to lying right in front of the baby's room door. Every night, Murphy stayed there, his eyes wide open even though his eyelids were heavy with weariness. When Lily cried, he shifted closer to the door. His ears perked up slightly, but he didn't bark. He simply listened. When Lily quieted down and fell back to sleep, he would retreat, lying close to the wall, exhaling deeply, feeling at peace. For Murphy, Lily wasn't someone who stole the family's affection. She was a new person who needed protection, just like how he once protected John when the boy was just learning to walk in the yard, or when he rushed out into the street to chase away a stray cat from David's car. It was an instinct that lived deep within every aging cell of Murphy's body. One evening, after settling Lily back to sleep, Emily stepped outside to fetch some water. She accidentally caught sight of Murphy lying close to the threshold of the room, his head resting gently on his front paws, his eyes still gazing inside. Emily paused for a moment. She bent down, her hand lightly touching Murphy's back. His fur was cold from the cool tile floor, but his body didn't shiver. Murphy remained still, like a living statue, persistent, steadfast, and needing no praise. "You're such a good boy, Murphy," Emily whispered softly, but her gaze quickly shifted to the baby's room, where Lily was sound asleep. Then, the door gently closed behind her. As for Murphy, he stayed there. No anger, no complaints. Because perhaps the only thing that made an old dog like him happy wasn't being petted or called by name, but simply being allowed to lie close enough to protect those he loved. The voice cut through the quiet hallway like a knife, slicing through the air. Murphy, startled, paused for a second, then lowered his ears, bowed his head, not barking, not even looking at the boy once. That silent shadow turned away, slowly stepping out of the hallway and disappearing towards the porch, as if accustomed to the feeling of being left behind. John didn't turn around. He didn't go down for dinner either. He just lay on his bed, face buried in the pillow, his heart heavy with a strange feeling, as if he had just lost something very important, yet couldn't quite name it. David and Emily, after putting Lily to sleep, noticed that John's door was still shut. David placed his hand on his wife's shoulder and sighed softly. "I've noticed John has been quieter than usual. Maybe we've been too focused on Lily." Emily nodded, a look of guilt flickering across her face. "He's so young and has to handle so much on his own. Before, whenever I was tired, John would get his own water, put on his pajamas, and sit with Murphy reading. Now I'm so busy that I barely have time to say a word before moving on." David thought for a moment, then said, "Maybe we should get someone to help with Lily. A nanny, perhaps, so we can spend more time with John." The next morning when John woke up, he saw a small plate of sausages already set out on the kitchen table. Emily had handed Lily to David, then turned to smile at John. "Those sausages are for you this morning, but if you don't want them, I think Murphy would like them." John looked down at the plate, then glanced around. Murphy wasn't inside. For a moment he hesitated, then picked up the plate and walked to the porch, the familiar spot he hadn't bothered to look at for the past few days. And there, Murphy was lying, his head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed as if nothing had ever happened. When he heard the footsteps, Murphy opened his eyes. Seeing John, he gave a soft wag of his tail, so gently as if afraid to break the fragile silence between them. John sat down next to Murphy. He placed the plate on the ground, gently nudging it towards the dog. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not daring to look him in the eye. "Yesterday, I didn't mean it. I thought no one needed me anymore." Murphy slowly licked the sausages, his eyes on the boy without an ounce of resentment. When he finished, Murphy moved closer and gently rested his head on John's lap. The boy didn't say anything else. He simply reached down and stroked the dry, brittle fur, now streaked with gray, and let out a soft laugh, the first one in days of gloom. Inside the house, David and Emily stood behind the curtains, watching the two shadows on the porch. No one said anything more. But that morning, as the gentle sunlight streamed through the windowsill, Something inside that house began to heal. Not necessarily because of a plate of sausages, nor because of an apology, but because of the unconditional loyalty, the kind only an old dog like Murphy could give, and make miracles happen. The life of the small family seemed to settle back into its usual peaceful rhythm. That is, until one evening, when the house was submerged in quiet darkness, only the soft golden light from the nightlight in the living room cutting through the stillness. Inside, everyone was fast asleep. Emily was holding baby Lily close, drifting off peacefully in her room, while David lay on his side, breathing evenly in the calm night. John had quietly tucked himself under the covers, his face buried in the pillow, the glow from the digital clock flickering steadily each second. Only Murphy, the old dog with smoky, clouded eyes, had not yet fallen asleep. Lying by the wall behind the dining room, Murphy stretched his legs out of the old rug, his ears lazily perked. He had grown accustomed to the sounds of footsteps, the clatter of dinnerware in the evening, John's occasional giggles, and even Lily's soft cries. But tonight, in the unusually long stretch of silence, Murphy sensed something, out of sync, not from inside the house, but from outside. A cold breeze seeped in through the gap in the door, a faint smell of cigarette smoke, almost undetectable, but enough to stir an old instinct in Murphy that had been dormant for years. It was a scent familiar to dogs who had lived near parking lots, shelters, or busy streets. The smell of people, but not people from this house. At the same time, a soft sound, like the tap of a heel against old concrete, came from the dining room window. Very quiet, like the wind brushing through leaves. But to Murphy, it was a signal that could not be mistaken. He stood up slowly, his movements sluggish and heavy. His back legs wobbled, and as he stood, his claws scraped lightly against the floor, producing a slow, deliberate sound. Murphy moved towards the window, his eyes fixed on the outside through the thin fabric of the curtain. The sky was dark, with no moon, only the faint yellow glow of the street lamp casting a weak beam through the window. But Murphy could still see a shadow of a person, not tall, wearing a hood, standing close to the edge of the porch, peering into the house. He growled softly, just enough to make his throat vibrate. In Murphy's mind, it didn't matter who it was. He didn't need to think. He knew his family was in danger. The rest of his actions were nothing more than the reflexes honed from years of training. Murphy turned around and bolted towards the bedroom, but no one heard the soft tap of his claws against the tile. He barked once, a weak, strangled bark in the dead of night, then barked again. Still, no one woke. Murphy ran to John's room, sat by the door, and continued barking. But the sound of his weak voice blended with the hum of the heater and was carried away by the night wind, barely audible. Murphy's eyes shifted towards Emily's room and then back to the shadow outside, crouching near the window, trying to pry open the latch. There was no more time. Murphy turned back to the dining room. Next to the table was a high shelf where Emily often placed a white porcelain vase, a wedding gift from her mother, and everyone knew how precious it was. Murphy knew too. How many times had John nearly tripped over it, only to be scolded? But now there was no other choice. The old dog braced himself. 1 step, 2 steps. He lowered his head, took a breath, and then, bang! Murphy rammed his head hard into the leg of the shelf. The vase wobbled for an instant. The sound of breaking porcelain rang out like a bell in the dead of night. A sharp, heavy crash reverberated through the house. The thief froze, his head snapping up. His eyes met the gaze of the dog staring through the window. The cloudy eyes of Murphy, now tilted to the side, barking once more, loud and clear. The sound of the ceramic breaking cut through the stillness of the night like a slash through the air, reverberating against the silent walls of the house that was deep in slumber. David was the first to jump up. His heart pounded wildly, briefly disoriented by the dim light and the lingering echoes. He turned to look at Emily. She had also opened her eyes, her hand instinctively placed on her belly. Without exchanging a word, David quickly got out of bed, barefoot, running down the hallway, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. The living room was pitch dark, only the faint light from the night light near the kitchen casting a dim glow. But on the wooden floor, near the foot of the shelf, a dark patch spread. The shards of the beloved ceramic vase Emily had brought back from her trip to Dalat before she became pregnant. David's eyes widened. That vase had been placed high, quite securely. How could it have fallen? Then he saw Murphy. The dog was standing near, panting, his eyes still fixed on the window. Murphy's entire body was poised, ready to confront something, though his old legs trembled with every breath. "What the hell's going on, Murphy?" David growled, but before he could take another step, Emily hurried from the hallway, still in her house slippers, her hair tousled behind her. Her eyes were a mix of sleepiness and shock as she saw the broken pieces on the floor, followed by an unmistakable sense of regret. "Oh no. The vase. It was the one I brought from Dalat, David." Her voice cracked, her hand pressing against her chest, as though trying to stop her heart from aching in the confusion. David turned to look at his wife, furrowing his brow before looking back at Murphy. "I don't understand. That vase was placed so high, how could it just— Murphy, did you knock it over?" he asked, but didn't wait for an answer. Even knowing a dog couldn't speak, David's gaze lingered on Murphy, as if searching for some acknowledgement. Murphy didn't move. He just panted. His hind legs shook, but his body remained rigid, eyes never leaving the window. Outside, the faint light from the street lamp cast a shadow across the window pane, turning Murphy into a solid silhouette, standing like a sentry, guarding something serious. Emily bent down to pick up a piece of broken ceramic, trembling. "I've told you so many times. Murphy's not as fast as he used to be. Why not let him sleep on the porch? It's broken now, but don't let him ruin anything else." She looked up, her voice no longer calm as usual. "I really cherished that vase, David. It was one of the few memories before I got pregnant. Murphy, he doesn't understand anymore." David opened his mouth to agree, but then his gaze froze. Murphy still hadn't turned his head, showing no sign of remorse or fear from their light scolding. Instead, that gaze was still locked on the window, not a moment of distraction. An unusual feeling crept into David's chest, like a silent warning, sending a chill down his spine. He stopped abruptly. Beneath the window, the curtain was slightly askew. David moved closer, one hand pulling the curtain aside, the other instinctively gripping the window frame in a defensive reflex. The window was still shut, but immediately he noticed something was off. The latch was misaligned, a thin gap between the two window panes that had never been there before, and on the wooden edge beneath the window, a fresh scratch next to it, the imprint of a shoe, faint mud stains. David's heart skipped a beat. He quickly turned around, shouting, "Emily, call the police right now!" Just a few minutes later, the once quiet house in the peaceful neighborhood was lit up by the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car. 2 officers inspected every corner around the window, then nodded in confirmation. Signs of attempted break-in. Someone had tried to pry open the living room window, possibly to test the house, or to actually break in. Luckily, the loud crash had startled the intruder and caused him to flee. Emily leaned against the armrest of the chair, her hand still on her belly, her eyes not fully escaping the shock. She looked at the broken vase, the ceramic shards scattered across the floor, some even crushed under Murphy's paws. The sense of regret welled up. But then, she looked at Murphy, the old dog lying there, still panting, his eyes fixed on the window, as if he still wasn't at ease. David slowed his steps toward the old dog, kneeling beside Murphy and placing his hand on his head. "You knew, didn't you?" His voice was hoarse, not from panic, but because something was breaking open inside of him, a mix of guilt, astonishment, and a hint of self-questioning. He had scolded Murphy for breaking the vase, had assumed the dog was just old and forgetful. Emily approached, taking David's hand. She whispered softly, almost afraid to startle Murphy. "Maybe we were wrong about Murphy." By then, John had woken up, stepping out of his room with sleepy eyes. He looked at his parents, then at Murphy, then at the broken vase. After a moment, he slowly walked over and sat beside Murphy. He didn't say anything, just gently placed his hand on the old dog's back, feeling the rapid breaths slow down. Murphy tilted his head, the brightness that had shone when he saw the intruder now softening, warmth returning as he gazed at the familiar face of the boy. The police continued to ask questions, taking down the details of the incident, snapping photos of the scene, and suggesting that the family check all the windows and locks. They also recommended installing a simple security camera for future safety. David nodded, thanking them, his face still tense but gradually easing. Emily hugged John, then looked at Murphy. Her gaze lingered longer than usual. No one spoke, but they all understood that without Murphy, tonight could have been very different. It might have been the sound of a window being pried open too late to react. It might have been an unexpected, dangerous confrontation. It might have been something none of them dared to imagine further. Once things settled down, David went back to clean up the last of the broken pieces, while Emily poured water for Murphy to drink. The old dog lay still, not whimpering, not barking, but his eyes were still alert, as if always ready to watch over anything moving in the darkness. The ceramic vase could be replaced, but what Murphy had preserved for the family, the peace, was something irreplaceable. In the dim light that remained, David sat down by the window, leaning against the wall. He looked at Murphy for a long time, then let out a quiet sigh. For the first time in many years, he whispered a sentence, not for anyone else to hear, but as if speaking to himself. "You're still our best guard dog, Murphy." After the events of that night, the family seemed to view Murphy a little differently. Still, life went on, with its usual rhythm, though it remained hectic. The closer Emily got to returning to her part-time job, the more overwhelmed she felt with caring for Lily, especially on those nights when the baby cried relentlessly due to teething, or when John, still needing attention from his parents, juggled school and whined. After much deliberation, David and Emily decided to hire a nanny to help. Sarah arrived one Monday morning, bringing with her a gentle smile and an unusually soft voice. She was in her early 30s, slim, with brown hair neatly tied behind, speaking softly and politely. From their first meeting, Emily breathed a sigh of relief. It felt as though she had found someone who could listen and help share the burden. David, being simpler in his judgments, declared, "We're lucky," the moment he saw Sarah cradle Lily so effortlessly and sing her lullabies in a voice as sweet as honey. The family gradually grew accustomed to Sarah's presence. John had no bad impressions. The boy had even once been helped by Sarah to fix a broken toy train set. But there was one member of the family who didn't share this comfort: Murphy. From the very first day Sarah stepped into the house, Murphy behaved unusually. The old dog didn't rush forward to greet her as he normally would. Instead, Murphy stood his ground, near the kitchen door, and watched Sarah with a curious gaze, his eyes fixed firmly on her every step. There was no barking, but there was no familiar wag of the tail either. Things became clearer on the third day when Sarah was holding Lily, trying to soothe her in the living room. Murphy, who had been lying near the sofa, suddenly jumped up and started barking sharply, not loudly, but enough to startle David, who was reading the paper at the dining table. Murphy moved closer to Sarah, his eyes seeming to pierce through every movement she made. His ears were up, his back stiff, his body slightly crouched, as though ready to pounce. Sarah immediately hugged Lily tight, stepped back a pace, her face pale. "Oh, this dog. He scared me half to death." David quickly snapped, "Murphy!" "No," then stood up and pulled Murphy back. Murphy didn't resist, only backing away a few steps, but his eyes never left Sarah. Emily, hearing the commotion from the kitchen, rushed out, her voice full of concern. "What's going on?" Sarah pursed her lips. "I think Murphy's just not used to strangers. But when I was holding the baby, he barked so loudly, the baby got scared and started crying." Emily looked at Murphy, then at Lily. The baby was burying her face in Sarah's neck, sniffling. I think Murphy's just jealous. Anyone who holds Lily lately makes him look like a stranger. Ever since we hired the nanny, he's been lying right by the baby's door." David sighed. "I think he'll get used to it in time." Each time Sarah walked by with Lily in her arms, Murphy would look up, his clouded eyes following them, unwilling to look away. And when the door clicked shut behind her, Murphy often lay by the door for a long time, his ears flicking, his nose sniffing the air from the crack beneath the door, his eyes filled with an unspoken doubt. Sarah, on the other hand, was always polite and soft-spoken. Whenever Emily apologized for any inconvenience Murphy might cause, Sarah would simply shake her head with a smile. "It's fine, I understand. Every dog goes through a phase." But every time their eyes met, there was something about it that made the air feel heavier, like both sides knew they were keeping a secret that couldn't yet be spoken. John once asked, "Why does Murphy keep barking at Sarah, Dad? He never did that before." David shrugged, chuckling lightly. "Maybe he's jealous of all the attention Lily's getting." But Murphy didn't change. Day by day, the vigilance in his gaze grew stronger. It wasn't blind hostility, but a sixth sense, the deep instinct of a soul that had experienced much, grown old, but never stopped listening to even the smallest movements in the house. A week had passed since Sarah officially became a part of the small family's home. From morning until late afternoon, she diligently soothed Lily to sleep, changed her diapers, fed her, and cooed to her in a soft, soothing voice. To Emily, Sarah's presence was a blessing. It gave her a chance to rest more, spend time with John, cook, or simply sit quietly with a cup of tea. David, on the other hand, didn't give it much thought. As long as his wife was happy, the house was peaceful, and the children were well cared for, that was enough for him. But Murphy was not the same. Though he had been banned from Lily's room and prevented from approaching Sarah, the old dog didn't abandon his duty of guarding. At first, there were the barks and cold stares. In the following days, Murphy began to appear every time Sarah was about to enter the baby's room. He didn't need anyone to call him, nor did he need to see. It was as if he could sense her presence. Each time, Murphy would walk over, stand in the middle of the hallway, blocking the path. He didn't bark anymore, but his gaze was so stern that Sarah had to pause for a few seconds before gently stepping around him. One afternoon, Emily had just finished changing Lily when she heard Murphy's slow steps in the hallway. She turned and saw him standing tall in front of the door, ears up, his eyes as if waiting for something. Sarah was holding a bottle, preparing to enter the room. As a reflex, Murphy took a step forward, blocking the door frame. Sarah exhaled, her smile faltering. "Murphy, step back, please." No response. David, hearing the commotion from the study, walked out, his voice sharp. "Murphy, back down." The dog didn't move. His gaze was slow but unwavering. Only when Emily stepped forward, placed a hand gently on Murphy's back, and nudged him did he finally step aside. But his head turned back, his eyes still fixed on Sarah. David sighed and frowned. Stubborn dog. He's getting more and more difficult. And you see, since Sarah arrived, he's been acting like this, as if he's losing his mind. Emily didn't respond immediately. She looked at Murphy, now quietly lying on the tile floor, his head still turned towards Lily's room, his ears twitching with every movement. "I don't know, but Murphy's never acted like this with anyone." David shrugged. "Probably jealousy. He's old now, people don't pay attention to him, and he's just getting upset for no reason. He's not as sharp as he used to be." Emily paused for a few seconds. Then she quietly spoke, not looking at David. "But if Murphy saved us from the electrical short, and from the burglary the other night, could this be another warning?" David raised an eyebrow, looking at his wife. Then he laughed, half joking, half serious. "You're suspecting Sarah? The woman who taught John to make paper fireworks and can put Lily to sleep for 2 hours straight?" Emily smiled weakly, shaking her head. But her eyes no longer held the same reassurance they once did. Since Murphy started growling whenever Sarah got close to Lily, a small thread of doubt had quietly started to grow inside her. Though faint, it stretched longer each day, winding like a vine that couldn't be named. The next day, Emily decided to test something small. When Sarah arrived, she pretended to be busy in the kitchen for longer than usual. She set up a chair in the corner of the hallway, closed the door to the baby's room, but didn't fully shut it, leaving a small crack. Murphy was still lying as usual in front of the door, but this time Emily didn't chase him away. She wanted to observe. Sarah entered the baby's room, gently picked up Lily, patted her back, and sat in the chair, starting to sing a lullaby. Her voice was still as gentle as ever, but there was something slightly hurried about it. Murphy stood up, took another step forward, and stood facing the slightly ajar door. His legs shook, but his eyes remained clear. Emily watched, waiting for something, but nothing happened. Everything proceeded peacefully, almost strangely so. After 10 minutes, she exhaled, feeling like she had been too suspicious. Perhaps David was right. Murphy was just getting old, irritable, sensitive, and maybe even paranoid. She stood up, moved towards the door, intending to open it to enter, when suddenly Murphy barked loudly. "Woof!" The bark echoed down the hallway, causing Lily to cry out in fright in Sarah's arms. Sarah jumped up, turning quickly, and caught Emily's gaze as she entered. "I'm sorry," Sarah stammered. "I was putting the baby to sleep so peacefully when he barked." Emily quickly cradled the baby, gently patting her back to calm her down. Murphy had fallen silent, but he still stood there, staring directly at Sarah. David still didn't believe it. He said, "If Murphy keeps this up, when the baby's scared of the barking, we'll be in trouble." Sarah gently suggested, "Maybe I'll just close the door every time I go into the baby's room. I don't feel comfortable either with Murphy always lying there." Emily hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded. Still, every time Sarah entered, Emily would glance over at Murphy. 3 days had passed since Emily began to observe Sarah's every action more closely, but everything still passed by in a strangely peaceful way. Sarah remained attentive, gentle, and always behaved appropriately. She smiled kindly when greeting David, asked after Emily, and chatted with John whenever the boy returned from school. She even taught John how to fold little paper cranes to hang around Lily's crib, an act that made Emily stop in her tracks with emotion, almost believing that her suspicions had been wrong. But Murphy had not changed. His vigilant gaze, the sudden barks, and the way he always lingered by the baby's room whenever Sarah was with Lily created a tension in the air that sometimes felt stifling. David started to show clear signs of irritation, and after being woken up twice in the night by Murphy's barking, he could no longer keep his patience. "We need to do something about him, Emily," David said while folding a small blanket for Lily. "I don't want our child growing up hearing strange barking every time someone takes care of her." Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked at Murphy, who was lying in the corner of the room, his head resting on his paws, his eyes still focused on Lily's room, even though the door was tightly shut. "I understand, but I still believe Murphy is trying to tell us something. We just haven't figured it out yet," she whispered before leaving the room. The next morning, David went on a business trip, and Emily was busy preparing a small dinner because her mother-in-law was coming over. Sarah arrived right on time, as usual, with her white shirt and neatly tied-up hair. Emily handed Lily over to her, gave some brief instructions, then headed to the kitchen to prepare her mother-in-law's favorite soup. The door to Lily's room was slightly ajar, as Sarah had gotten used to locking it from the inside. But that day, perhaps due to haste or carelessness, she forgot to turn the latch. Murphy, however, still lay nearby, unmoving from his spot. The soft lullaby drifted from inside the room, mixing with the sound of spoons clinking against the soup pot in the kitchen. Emily didn't hear anything unusual, but Murphy did. A rustling sound, then a soft thud, as if something had fallen. And then Lily cried. First it was a small whimper, then quickly escalated into a loud scream, not the typical cries from hunger, but a sharp, high-pitched wail that seemed out of place. Murphy jumped up. Without thinking, he bolted toward the door that hadn't been latched, using his head to force it open. Sarah, who had just turned around, barely registered what was happening before Murphy entered, growling distinctly. "Stay away from her!" Murphy's eyes seemed to say. Sarah turned pale. The crib had tilted to one side. Lily was still crying, her limbs flailing. Sarah started to move towards her, but Murphy blocked the way, his growls low and threatening. Emily, hearing Lily's unusually loud cries from the kitchen, instinctively rushed upstairs. At the same time, John looked up from his book, sensing something was wrong. They met at the doorway just as Murphy suddenly turned around, ready to approach the crib, but his front leg slipped on the small rug, causing his body to bump into the edge of the crib. The crib swayed. Then, it tipped over. Lily, who wasn't strapped in because Sarah thought she would sleep soundly, tilted over to one side. Thankfully, the crib didn't fall to the floor, but the violent tilt caused Lily to cry even louder, her face flushed with panic. "Oh my God!" Emily screamed, rushing to scoop her up, just as David arrived at the door, rushing up instinctively when he heard the shout. Sarah, trembling, pointed at Murphy. "He charged in!" I turned away to grab a towel, and he rushed in and made the crib tip. David, furious, yelled, "Murphy! Oh my God, how could you do that?" The old dog stood still, neither advancing nor retreating. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah, as if trying to say something that no one was willing to listen to. John stepped in last, seeing Lily's face soaked with tears, Murphy standing in the middle of the room like a criminal, and his parents so angry they were on the verge of making a decision. He suddenly felt afraid, not of Murphy, but of what was about to come after that sentence. And then David growled, "We can't keep it in the house anymore?" Emily held Lily tighter, not saying a word. In her eyes was a storm, confusion, worry, and heartache. She wasn't sure if what Sarah said was true, but she couldn't understand why Murphy had barged into the baby's room like that. Only Murphy, still standing there, silent, his eyes lowered, his ears drooping, turning his head and walking out of the room on his own, without needing anyone to chase him. The small house nestled quietly in the alley, where the streetlight cast a soft glow through the fogged window, and that night an unusual stillness settled over it. Every word spoken during dinner was softer than usual. No one laughed, and no one mentioned the incident from the afternoon. Sarah had gone back to her room. Emily fed Lily and placed her in the crib, while John sat at his desk, his face lowered, his pen spinning slowly on a blank sheet of paper. Murphy lay curled up in the corner of the room, near the back door, the place that had once been his favorite spot on regular days. But now, that silent shadow seemed to remind everyone of something that was about to be cast aside. David sat at the edge of the sofa, his eyes fixed on the empty space before him, his grip tight around the TV remote without turning it on. His forehead was furrowed, his gaze still mixed with anger and confusion. Finally, he stood up, walked over to Murphy. The old dog raised his head to look at him, his eyes cloudy and tired, but not fearful. "Go outside," David said, his voice low but as heavy as stone. Murphy didn't move. He didn't lower his ears as he would when scolded, nor did he growl in resistance. He just looked, with eyes that carried no reproach, no bitterness, only silence, as though he had grown accustomed to it long ago. David opened the back door, and the smell of damp earth and cold air rushed in. The rain had started to fall, each drop heavy and steady, tapping against the roof like it was knocking into the heart. Emily stood quietly in the kitchen, not stepping out, but she saw everything. She saw the light from the door casting onto Murphy's back, saw David quickly turning away as if avoiding his own gaze. She saw Murphy slowly rise, his joints creaking in protest, but he still walked, step by step, towards the door. No bark, no plea. Emily didn't speak. She only lowered her head, clutching the now cold cup of tea in her hands. The moment Murphy stepped out of the door, she turned away, but her heart ached, as though someone had squeezed a beat out of it. John quietly opened his room door, cracking it just enough. He saw Murphy walk down the steps, his thin figure disappearing into the rain. But he didn't call out, didn't shout. He still held on to the things that hadn't been erased. The shout earlier, his father's angry gaze, his mother's silence, and Murphy's quiet stare as he was pushed out of the threshold. John sat by the door, leaning against the wall, closing his eyes, as though by not seeing, everything would simply pass. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Each drop hitting the pavement formed ripples, reflecting the streetlight like smeared streaks of light. The wind howled through the trees, rattling against the old tin roof. Murphy walked slowly along the backyard fence. He had no destination, no place to shelter, just walking, by instinct. A four-door car turned into the alley, its headlights sweeping across the wet yard. The driver didn't see the small figure crossing the street. The car came toward him at a moderate speed, but it was enough to make the moment feel suffocating. Murphy continued, unhurried, unpanicked. The headlights hit Murphy just as he reached the edge of the road. The driver slammed the brakes, the tires screeching loudly on the slick road. Murphy stopped for just half a second, then quickly backed away. The car came to a stop before anything serious happened. The driver opened the door, stepping out into the rain, looking around confusedly. But Murphy had quickly veered into the grassy patch by the road, disappearing like a shadow. No one saw. No one knew. Murphy kept walking, blending into the thickening rain. Inside the house, the lights were still on, and David was drying his hands after closing the back door. He didn't say anything more. Emily sat quietly on the chair, Lily asleep in her arms, her tiny hand holding onto her mother's finger, peacefully dreaming. But Emily's gaze remained fixed on the empty space behind the door, where Murphy had stepped out only minutes before. Inside her, something silently sank. Not exactly guilt, nor regret, but a vague feeling of loss, as if something very important had been left behind, unspoken, unacknowledged. "Do you think he knows he's been kicked out?" David asked, his voice hoarse after a long silence. Emily didn't respond. She was sitting on the sofa, cradling Lily in her arms, her eyes staring vacantly into the dark space between the living room. "I just want to protect you," David continued, but this time it wasn't directed at anyone in particular. Perhaps he was speaking to himself. The rain had not stopped. The long streaks of water on the window pane curved like faint scratches on the sun that had just peeked through the thick clouds. Inside the house, once filled with the sounds of children and Murphy's laughter, there was only the cold ticking of the wall clock, and a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Emily had just woken up, her back still damp from a restless night. She could still feel the cold from the rain that had seeped through the cracks in the windows. Her eyes immediately shifted toward the backyard, where David had opened the door and let Murphy out the night before. There was no barking, no scuffing of paws, no heavy sigh from an old dog who had grown accustomed to lying curled up in the corner. The instinct of a mother made her shiver. Emily silently slipped on a thin jacket and walked down the hallway, her heart racing as she approached Murphy's crate. But it was empty. The old blanket was still there, soaking wet and cold. The stainless steel bowl seemed untouched. Emily froze. A lump formed in her throat, making it hard for her to speak. She turned and ran inside, calling loudly, "David, Murphy's not in the crate anymore!" Her voice echoed in the empty house. David had just come out of the bedroom, holding Lily, and stopped when he heard. John was brushing his teeth in the bathroom, but a few seconds later, he rushed out, his towel draped over his neck, his eyes wide with confusion. What do you mean he's not in the crate?" he asked. Emily clenched her hands together, trying to stay calm. "I woke up early and checked. The crate is empty. The back door is still closed and there are no muddy paw prints inside. Maybe Murphy left on his own." John stood frozen, not out of surprise, but because something sharp pierced through his chest. The feeling, it felt so familiar. It was the sharp pang from words he had spoken a few days ago, in a burst of anger. "I wish Murphy would just disappear." And now, it seemed that wish had come true. Is it my fault?" John's voice cracked, barely audible, as if the words were caught in his throat. David placed Lily in her crib, then knelt down in front of his son, his hand resting on John's shoulder. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the regret in his eyes was hard to hide. "No, John." But John wouldn't listen. He pulled away from his father's grip, running straight to the bedroom. A few seconds later, he came out, wearing a messy raincoat, holding a small package of sausages, Murphy's favorite. He wiped his tears away and looked at his dad. "I have to go find him. I have to apologize. Murphy must think I hate him." Emily tried to stop him, but then she looked at David. His expression was heavy. Finally, David nodded. "All right, I'll go with you. We'll search together. You stay here with Lily. If Murphy comes back, let me know." Emily nodded softly, gripping her husband's hand before he put on his raincoat and stepped out the door. John followed behind, the small boy nearly blending into the faint rain outside. His small steps splashed through puddles, mud, the alleyway, the backyard, each familiar corner where Murphy had once basked in the sun, waited for John to return from school, sniffed the air before a storm would roll through. John called out hoarsely as he walked, "Murphy! Murphy! Please come back!" Each call was a desperate plea, echoing through the empty street. Sometimes he would stop, clutching the sausages tightly in his hand, his eyes wet as he stared at the cold emptiness ahead. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. You're not just an obstacle. You're the only friend I ever had." David headed towards the nearby market, asking the vendors, the street cleaners, the shadows lurking behind small houses. But no one had seen an old dog, dark brown fur, cloudy eyes, weak legs. "With this rain, if he's gone far, it's going to be hard to track him down," an old man with a bicycle said, shaking his head. David turned away, his heart heavy. The image of Murphy curled up under the porch, silently uncomplaining, flashed through his mind like a knife slicing into his thoughts. No one had ever asked, "Is Murphy cold? Is he in pain? Is he lonely?" And now, with Murphy gone, all those questions turned into painful, relentless aches. At that moment, John had reached the tree at the end of the alley, the place where he and Murphy had sat eating ice cream last summer. The boy was panting, his shoes soaked, his eyes red from crying. "Murphy, you liked this spot, didn't you? You always waited for me here." The wind blew through, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth, but there was no familiar figure in sight to answer. John stood there for a long time. Then he sat down, placing the piece of sausage on his palm, gently covering it with his soaking wet jacket. The rain still fell, but the boy didn't cry anymore. He just looked up at the misty sky and whispered, "I'll wait. No matter how long it takes, I'll wait for you to come back." And somewhere in the cold, pouring rain of the early morning, an old pair of ears twitched, as if it had heard the call it had been longing for all through the long night. The cold, damp air clung to every step. John trudged forward, his raincoat clinging to his back, his face soaked with water, but not just from the rain. His eyes were swollen and red from crying too much, and his voice was hoarse from hours of searching. "Murphy, please come back. I'm sorry." He repeated the words like a fragile prayer, sending them into the cold, vast air. It had been over 3 hours since he left home. David was searching near the park's edge, and Emily was at home caring for Lily, her heart burning with worry. John turned into a small street, one he rarely passed. It was an old row of houses near the old market, where a few shops had opened early this morning. As he passed an intersection, he froze. Between the high trash bins and a weathered wall, there was a familiar figure huddled in the damp shadow. "Murphy!" John exclaimed, as if his soul had found its way back home. He rushed forward, slipping and falling a short distance, but he quickly got up, kneeling beside the old dog. Murphy lay there, his fur soaked and matted, his body curled tightly against itself, his breathing heavy and ragged. But when he heard the familiar call, his ears flicked slightly. Then, with great effort but clear intent, Murphy opened his eyes. "Murphy, I'm sorry. Please don't leave. Come home with me," John said, his hands wrapping around the frail body, pressing his head against the shivering old dog. Murphy didn't react immediately, but after a moment he let out a weak groan, a sound so fragile that it made John burst into tears. Then Murphy slowly lifted his head, gently touching his nose to the boy's cheek. It wasn't a lick like usual, not the exuberance of a healthy dog, but a fragile gesture filled with forgiveness. David found them as he turned onto the street. His eyes lit up when he saw his son sitting next to Murphy. He hurried over, kneeling beside the two small figures. He looked at Murphy, his cloudy eyes panting heavily but still gleaming with resilience. "Oh, Murphy, I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry," David whispered, placing one hand on Murphy's head, the other wrapping around John. "Dad, he forgives me," John choked, his hands still holding on to Murphy. Without hesitation, David picked up Murphy with both hands, feeling the cold, damp body and the weight that had become much lighter than it used to be. He carefully placed Murphy in the back seat, covering him with a dry towel, and then, with John beside him, they made their way back home. On the way, John didn't take his eyes off Murphy. He draped his raincoat over the dog, whispering apologies, telling little stories about past memories, as if trying to fill the void that had been neglected for so long. Murphy lay there, his eyes half closed, breathing more evenly, though still labored, as if sensing the warmth of his family returning. When they got home, Emily burst into tears when she saw David carrying Murphy inside. She rushed to him, holding him tightly for a long moment before pulling a chair for David to place the dog next to the heater. "I'll call the vet." She shakily grabbed the phone. The vet arrived just 15 minutes later. He examined Murphy thoroughly, taking his temperature, listening to his heartbeat, and checking his lungs. Finally, he sighed with relief. He's not seriously injured. Fortunately, he still has some resistance. But Murphy needs to stay warm, eat well, and rest. At his age, a night like that can be very dangerous. Emily nodded repeatedly, her tears still flowing. David looked at John, who was sitting close to Murphy, his eyes softer after the tense days. He bent down, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We've neglected Murphy for too long, haven't we, son?" John nodded, whispering. But he didn't really leave. He was just waiting for us to realize. That night, Murphy slept on the soft mattress beside John's bed, a large towel draped over him. Emily made some thin porridge, and David set a small heater by the edge of the bed. The house lit up with a familiar feeling that had seemed to have long forgotten its place, the warmth from a loyal heart that had never turned away, despite being pushed out of the beloved door so many times. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house seemed to soften, as if after a storm had passed. The sun peeked out, its first rays shimmering through the window, casting light onto the wooden floor, still warm from the marks of footsteps. John was still sleeping soundly, his hand resting lightly on Murphy's back, as though he feared the dog would disappear if he didn't touch him. Murphy was breathing steadily, eyes closed, not in a deep sleep, but in a peaceful state. Despite still feeling the fatigue from the night's rain, the warmth of the house and the gentle touches from his young master seemed to make Murphy feel truly welcomed back. Emily stood at the doorway, holding a cup of hot tea, her gaze softer than ever. Last night she hadn't said much. She simply sat beside Murphy, gently stroking his graying fur and whispering apologies. This morning she had risen earlier than usual, reheated the porridge, carefully placing it in a small ceramic bowl, and set it next to Murphy's mattress. For the first time in months, Emily didn't do this out of habit or responsibility, but from the heart, as though she were caring for a loved one who had just returned from a great ordeal. David had also changed. He no longer muttered in annoyance when he saw Murphy lying in the way or shedding fur on the carpet. On the contrary, he quietly took the broom and swept up every strand of hair, without a word of complaint. In the mornings, before leaving the house, he would bend down, gently touch Murphy's head, and give a soft pat. No longer a mere passing gesture, but one full of silent gratitude. He didn't say much, but his eyes, every time they looked at Murphy, always held a silent regret. But even as love was being returned, One thing hadn't changed: Sarah's presence. After the rainy night's incident, Emily started paying closer attention to Sarah. She tried to observe every gesture, every look of the young nanny. But through those days, Sarah continued to behave attentively, gently, and with an extra touch of grace. She never raised her voice, always cradling Lily with both arms tenderly, occasionally singing lullabies in a soft whisper. Every time Emily caught her gaze, Sarah would smile lightly and shrug as if she didn't understand why she was being doubted. David was more decisive. "I think Murphy just doesn't like Sarah. Old dogs, you know, they're sensitive to smells, to strangers, especially after we've been through so much. Maybe he's just not fully recovered yet." Emily remained silent, rubbing the back of her hand. She didn't speak the haunting thought in her mind. Murphy had warned them twice, once during the electrical short, and once when the thief had broken in. In both instances, if it hadn't been for the stubborn old dog, their family might not be whole today. And now, Murphy was growling every time Sarah entered the room. It wasn't a sign of jealousy. It felt like an instinctual protective behavior, the same instinct that had saved them from unnamed dangers. Sarah, with her sweet voice and polite demeanor, only made it harder for Emily to decide, especially when Lily was still safe in the nanny's arms, still sleeping soundly every time Sarah sang her to sleep. But Murphy never took his eyes off them. Every time Sarah picked Lily up, Murphy would rise slightly, growling softly in his throat, his eyes narrowing with tension. That afternoon, the sky seemed to be covered by a thin layer of gray clouds, gloomy, but not thick enough to turn into rain. Inside the Carter family's small home, everything was unusually quiet. Emily and David had just left for a last-minute work meeting, planning to return in less than 2 hours. John was still at school, and at home. There were only 2 of the smallest and oldest members, little Lily sleeping in her room, and Murphy, the old dog, lying quietly by the door of her room. From the morning, Murphy had acted strangely. He didn't leave the hallway, where the door to Lily's room always stood slightly ajar. Every time Sarah, the newly hired nanny, passed by, Murphy's eyes followed her, his head slightly lowered, ears drooping as if ready to spring into action. There was no growling, no barking, but a sense of vigilance clung to each of the dog's breaths. Sarah walked out of the kitchen with the freshly heated bottle, murmuring something to herself before turning back to the room. Murphy quietly stepped back to give way, but never took his eyes off her. As was her habit, Sarah slammed the door behind her, separating herself from the scrutinizing gaze of anyone. But this time, something unexpected happened in the small room. Lily woke up earlier than expected. She turned over, whimpered lightly, then began crying loudly. Sarah furrowed her brows, biting her lip. It seemed like she hadn't slept all night. Or perhaps she had simply lost her patience. Instead of gently bending down as she usually did in front of the family, Sarah placed the bottle on the shelf, then turned around, grabbing the edge of the crib and shaking it violently. Her face contorted, each line of frustration rising beneath her thin skin. "Shut up! Please, just shut up!" Lily cried louder. She was barely 4 months old, her cries still weak, broken, and filled with panic. Her tiny hands flailed in the air, her legs curled as if trying to move away from the source of the fear. Outside, Murphy leaped up. His ears, dull from age, still managed to pierce through the crying. Without hesitation, the old dog rushed toward the door of the room. His left leg faltered, stumbling as he walked, but he pushed himself forward with all his might. Reaching the door, Murphy scratched lightly with his paw. No response. He scratched again, harder. Still, no answer. Then Murphy barked, a hoarse, weak bark, but sharp and determined. In the empty house, the sound echoed, twisting into the air, seeping into every corner. Inside, Sarah froze. She stopped what she was doing, her eyes darting toward the door. Her face paled for a moment, but quickly turned cold. She walked over, not to open the door, but instead grabbed a nearby stool and placed it against the door from the inside, as if trying to block any attempt to approach. Murphy barked again, growling, scratching the door with his worn-down claws. No one answered. No one opened. The thick, silent door stood like a wall, as if it were a barrier separating the dog from whatever he was trying to communicate. But Murphy didn't give up. He took a few steps back, then charged at the door, slamming into it with all his force. The sound of the impact was so loud that the walls shuddered slightly. He backed away and tried again, each time hitting the door, his body shaking with the effort. But his dull eyes remained focused, locked on the source of the baby's cries coming from the other side. Sarah was truly scared now. She turned her head to look at Lily. The baby's face was red, tears streaming down her cheeks. The child could not defend herself, but outside the door was a creature that Sarah never expected would have the strength to resist. Murphy barked again, this time decisive, hoarse. His legs could no longer stand firm. He sat down heavily, panting, his tongue hanging out, but his gaze never left the door. And then Lily's scream tore through the air, a sound that made the elderly neighbor, Mrs. Miller, freeze. Without hesitation, she leaned on her cane and hurriedly crossed the fence. Murphy's gaze, though tired, still fixed on the closed door of the room, where Sarah, now panicked, was looking around, unsure of what she had just awakened. Lily's cry shattered the silence. It wasn't the usual cry of an infant. It was a strangled, horrifying sound, as though the baby was struggling in a nightmare with no escape. From the neighboring house, Mrs. Miller, an elderly neighbor who was familiar with Lily's cries every morning, looked up suddenly from her steaming teacup. She frowned. An uneasy feeling arose in her heart, as she realized this cry was different from the usual. It was sharper, more fragmented, and stretched on in desperate tones. Then Murphy's hoarse bark rang out once again, urgent, relentless, almost desperate. No more signs were needed. Mrs. Miller immediately leaned on her cane and left her porch, moving quickly through the low gate to the Carter house. Her long woolen dress brushed the damp earth, but she paid it no mind. Since David and Emily had moved in, she had always kept an eye on the young family, and Murphy, the old dog, had always been a loyal companion whenever she visited. The door was unlocked. This wasn't unusual, as the neighbors in this area trusted each other and lived harmoniously. But this time, that openness paved the way for the truth to be revealed. She entered, and immediately encountered the sight of Murphy lying panting on the living room floor near the shards of the broken ceramic vase. His eyes were still fixed on a closed door at the end of the hallway. His barking had stopped, but low, worried whimpers still emanated from his throat. The door to Lily's room. Mrs. Miller called softly, "Murphy?" The dog raised his head, struggling to crawl a few steps toward her, then turned his head back to the door, as if silently pleading. Not able to wait any longer, Mrs. Miller hurried to the door of Lily's room, her hand trembling as she twisted the doorknob. But the door didn't open. It was blocked from the inside. She tried to push again. No use. Something heavy had been propped up just behind the door, enough to prevent anyone from opening it from the outside, but quiet enough not to make a sound if you weren't paying attention. Her heart began to race. From inside, Lily's crying was still unabated, frantic and broken, as if the little throat could no longer make a sound. Murphy lay there, panting at her feet, his gaze still fixed on the door, as if begging, "Please, look, go in!" There was no way in from the hallway. Mrs. Miller stepped back, her eyes scanning the room before she quickly ran around to the side of the house, where a window led into the baby's room. The curtain was slightly pulled back, and the dim light of the evening filtered through, just enough for her to see inside. And the sight that met her through the glass froze her in place. Sarah, the gentle nanny everyone trusted, was standing next to the crib, her hands gripping the wooden sides tightly, her face twisted with anger. Her hair was disheveled, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps, and in her eyes was a look that sent a chill through Mrs. Miller. Cold, uncontrollable. She was shaking the crib so violently that the wheels on the bottom rattled and clattered against the floor. "Shut up! I said shut up!" Sarah hissed, her voice sharp and high-pitched, slicing through the air. Little Lily's face turned bright red, her tiny hands weakly flailing. Her mouth was open in a helpless cry, as if that tiny throat no longer had the strength to call out. Her eyes were wide, tear-filled, lost and terrified in the most pitiful way. Mrs. Miller staggered back. Her heart twisted in a sharp, cold pain, a mixture of fear and rage. Without hesitation, she pulled her phone from her pocket, took a half-step back to avoid Sarah's gaze, and dialed the emergency number. Her voice, though trembling, remained clear and determined. "This is Mrs. Miller from house number 36. There's evidence of child abuse at house number 38. Please send the police immediately. It's urgent." As soon as the call ended, she immediately texted Emily, her fingers typing quickly but decisively. "Come home right now. The nanny is not right. I just saw her shaking Lily's crib." Her hands were still shaking as she tucked the phone back into her pocket. She turned back to the window, peering inside again. Sarah had stopped, her chest heaving as she wiped sweat from her forehead. It seemed she had just realized she had crossed the line, but it was too late. Mrs. Miller had seen it all. At the foot of the window, Murphy, though no longer able to stand for long, stretched his neck and barked one last time. The hoarse sound rang out amidst the biting wind of the fading afternoon, a bark that seemed to close the chapter on a long series of endured silence. The police car pulled away from the small alley, leaving behind the flashing lights flickering in the gray afternoon. Sarah sat silently in the back seat, her face pale, not saying a word. All the masks she had worn, soft words, gentle smiles, had turned into a frightening facade. In the yard of house number 38, Mrs. Miller still stood, her phone clenched tightly in her hand, her eyes both resolute and stunned. The iron gate opened. Emily rushed in as if she had been pushed from behind. In her arms was Lily, still hiccuping with tears. She hugged her tightly, her trembling hand brushing over the baby's soft, sweaty hair. Her eyes were red, but no tears fell. Everything was caught in her throat, only the words repeating in her mind. If it wasn't for Murphy, if it wasn't for Murphy. John had also come home from school, holding on to his mother's dress, silent. He only looked at Lily, then at Murphy, lying quietly by the threshold, breathing heavily, his fur covered in dust, still shivering from exhaustion. The boy walked over, sat down next to the dog, and placed his hand on Murphy's back. Beneath his hand, he felt the dry, shriveled muscles, thin but still tense, twitching slightly with every small noise from behind. Murphy was not asleep. He remained alert in his own way, like an old soldier who had not allowed himself to relax, despite his body being worn out. David didn't say anything during the first half hour after he returned. He had witnessed everything when he entered from the back door. The look of panic on Sarah's face as she was handcuffed, Lily's voice breaking as she cried, Mrs. Miller's gaze, without reproach, only sadness, as she handed the house back to its rightful owners. But what choked David's chest was the image of Murphy lying by the doorway, not growling, not barking, just staring at him. His cloudy eyes, wet with tears, but with no sign of blame. He knelt down. A sharp pain shot through his knee, but David didn't care. His hand gently rested on Murphy's shoulder, caressing in a full circle before stopping at the back of his neck. "You always knew better than all of us," he whispered. And for the first time in many months, David's voice caught in his throat. He inhaled deeply, but couldn't hold it together any longer. Everything flooded back to his mind like a film rewinding. Murphy growling when Sarah approached Lily, Murphy being sent outside into the pouring rain, Murphy lying weak in the street, Murphy barking loudly in the night to save them from a thief, and that blank look Murphy gave when he was wrongly blamed for making Lily fall from her crib. Emily sat beside her husband, holding Lily in her arms, silently watching every word David spoke. Her eyes glistened with tears. Why didn't we believe him? The quiet question was a whisper in her chest, aching deeply. Why did we think he was just an old animal, no longer of any use? She squeezed Lily tighter, as if afraid that just letting go for a second would cause her to lose everything she had. Mrs. Miller had told Emily how Murphy had barked, slammed into the door, never taking his eyes off the room, how he had tried to call out in desperation. And now, that image played in her head like a film. Murphy, the dog she once loved, now lying still, as though he had never done anything heroic. Only his eyes still shone brightly in the night, shining with an unexplainable loyalty, something that could not be bought or traded, only felt by the heart. John sat close to Murphy, saying nothing. He pulled a small sausage from his jacket pocket, wrapped in a napkin, the same one he had kept from his previous apology. "I saved this for you," he whispered. "You seemed to like it last time." Murphy didn't eat. He only nudged his nose gently against the boy's hand, then rested his head on the boy's lap. John's small chest trembled. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "I was wrong. Sometimes kids like me don't understand anything. But now I understand, Murphy. You're the only one who knew everything from the beginning." David glanced at his wife, their eyes meeting without the need for words. The silence between them now felt like the most powerful language. In that moment, Murphy, the dog once seen as past his prime, a nuisance, an old, useless creature, once again lay in the heart of their family, as the center of a circle of love that had been fractured and was now slowly being mended. Later, the police confirmed that Sarah's actions met the criteria for child abuse. A full report was sent to both of them, but David didn't read the entire report. He only focused on one line that the officer had said as he was leaving. "It's a good thing your dog was so vigilant. The baby's safe because of him." That sentence echoed in his mind like a slap, a constant reminder. Since that gloomy afternoon, when Sarah was taken away and the truth was fully revealed, the atmosphere in the little house on the corner seemed to change completely. All the doors that had once kept Murphy outside were now wide open. No more Lily's room, no dogs allowed, no more unspoken rules that had made Murphy curl up at the threshold every night. Instead, right next to Lily's crib, a thick cotton mattress was neatly laid down, covered with a soft blanket patterned with light blue stars, a gift Emily had personally chosen when she went to the store the next day. Murphy didn't need an invitation. It simply walked over and lay down next to the mattress as though it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Under the soft orange glow of the nightlight, its fur, streaked with gray, looked unexpectedly gentle. Lily lay in the crib, her tiny hand reaching out into the air, babbling as if talking to someone. Murphy barely lifted its head, gazing at the baby with kind eyes, the eyes of a silent guard, enduring but never retreating. David, once the person who would shake his head when Murphy blocked his way, was now the one who scheduled their evening walks. He knew Murphy's legs had grown weak, and it couldn't run like before, so instead of going far, they would only walk around the small park a few blocks away. Every step Murphy took was slow and unsteady, but never stopped. And David, walking beside his old dog, would sometimes stop, bend down to gently pat Murphy's back and whisper, "Beautiful weather today, isn't it?" John had changed, more than anyone else. He would always drop his bag and run to find Murphy. No longer calling the dog a nuisance, as he once had in a childish tantrum, John now sat down to read stories to Murphy. Simple fairy tales told in his small, tender voice. "Listen, Murphy," John would whisper. "I'll read this chapter, and then you can sleep." Every morning, Emily would sit beside Murphy before the rest of the house woke up. She'd gently stroke its frail back, her eyes following its every breath. "We owe you more than an apology," she would whisper. "We owe you a life where you were never abandoned." At those times, Murphy would lie still, its tail faintly wagging, eyes half closed as if responding with a forgiveness that had never been withdrawn. There were no longer any limits for Murphy in the house. The living room, the kitchen, the back porch, even the bathroom. Murphy was allowed to go anywhere. The way everyone always made sure not to trip over it, always leaving a small path just wide enough for Murphy to slip through, was an unspoken yet profound change. Murphy was no longer an obstacle, but the heartbeat of the family. One morning, David installed a small window frame just at Murphy's level in the kitchen. "So you can see out into the backyard," he said, then placed a cushion just beneath the wooden frame. Murphy lay there, its eyes fixed on the sunlit garden where sparrows chirped as they flitted between the branches, where John practiced riding his bike, and where Lily lay in her crib, babbling cheerfully. At night, when the house sank into silence, Murphy still kept the habit of lying in front of Lily's room. But this time, no one pushed it out. Instead, Emily would place a small pillow under Murphy's head, covering it with a warm blanket. Whenever she passed by, there was always a gentle bow of her head and a whispered, "Good night, Murphy." And sometimes it was Emily who stopped longer, sitting next to Murphy, gazing at it as though looking into the memory of a lifetime. "You've been with us for 11 years, she would say softly. "From when John was just babbling his first words to when little Lily was born. Perhaps you've grown old along with the happiest moments of this family." Murphy didn't answer. It just lay there, its ears twitching slightly every time it heard the familiar footsteps. Though old, and despite every movement requiring effort, Murphy had never stopped observing, never stopped loving, never stopped protecting. For it, love wasn't something to be spoken. It was something silently carried out, day by day, night by night, without needing to be acknowledged. Mrs. Miller, the elderly neighbor, also often stopped by. Every time she brought some biscuits and a small bag of carrots. "Good for the bones," she'd say, sitting down beside Murphy, gently patting its head. "You're old, but you've never failed to earn respect." Since the day Sarah was arrested, the house seemed to be pieced back together, little by little. The family not only learned to forgive one another, but also learned how to listen, deeply, truly, even to the unspoken sounds, like the tired barks of Murphy on that rainy night, or the mournful, cloudy eyes once thought to be lifeless. And Murphy, though older now, though no longer able to stand guard at the door every night, still remained as the silent soul of that home. It didn't need to wag its tail vigorously or run through the house. Just lying there, in the embrace of the family, its warm gaze was enough to let the world know. Loyalty doesn't lie in youth, but in a heart that never changes. After everything that had happened, the Carter family's home had changed, not only in how they treated Murphy, but also in how they preserved memories and values that could never be measured by material means. David was the first to suggest the idea one evening when the family was gathered together. Lily was peacefully sleeping in Emily's arms, and Murphy was lying by John's feet, its tail occasionally wagging when the boy leaned down to whisper something. "I think we should have a special corner for Murphy," David said, his eyes never leaving the old dog who was peacefully resting. "Not just for what it's done, but because it deserves it." Emily nodded immediately. In her eyes was a profound sense of emotion. She understood that nothing could truly repay what Murphy had silently endured. Being pushed away, misunderstood, the nights spent alone in the rain, or the moments of pouring every ounce of strength into saving a tiny life. But at least they could preserve all of that, through a space in the house and a place in the hearts of every family member. So that weekend, the whole family worked together to clean up the corner of the living room, near the window, where an old, worn-out bookshelf had once stood, to create a new space. Murphy's Corner. John proudly wrote the name on a small wooden sign. His childish handwriting was crooked but filled with pride. He even drew a floppy ear and a curled tail, Murphy's most distinct features, unmistakable to anyone who knew him. On the white wall, Emily hung up photos that had been printed from her phone. Some showed Murphy lying next to Lily's crib. Others were taken when Murphy wore the red scarf that John had tied around his neck, basking in the golden autumn sunlight. The most cherished photo was an old one. John, at 2 years old, hugging Murphy when they first adopted him from the shelter. That image, a tiny boy with chubby cheeks, his hands wrapped around the neck of a little puppy still covered in mud, made anyone who looked at it smile. David also placed a frame with the words, "Murphy," the silent hero of the Carter family. Below it was a small printed list detailing all the times Murphy had warned the family of danger, written by John by hand, carefully pasted onto light blue paper. "I'm making a hero file for Murphy," John said proudly. Since the creation of Murphy's Corner, the house had become a familiar destination for the neighborhood children. Every afternoon after school, a few kids would come over, bringing cookies, small sausages, or simply an old handkerchief to wipe Murphy's fur. They were all fascinated by the Murphy legend, an intelligent, brave dog who had discovered burglars and saved little Lily. Once, a little girl named Lucy, one of the neighbors, asked her parents to get a puppy just like Murphy. "I want to have a dog like Murphy," she said, "so every night it can lie next to my bed and guard me from monsters." Emily's eyes welled up at the child's innocent words. It turned out that the love and loyalty of an old dog could spread far beyond what they ever imagined. Murphy, in the eyes of the children, was not an old, frail animal, but a great friend, gentle, calm, and always cheerful, despite his declining health. Even though his legs no longer moved as swiftly as before, Murphy still wagged his tail whenever a tiny hand reached out to pet him. When the children touched his thinning fur, Murphy would simply lie still, his eyes closing as if savoring each moment. Once, a Boulder boy placed a paper flower wreath around Murphy's neck. He only sneezed once, then lay motionless, as though accepting a new honorary title. On sunny days, the family would often spread a blanket right in front of Murphy's Corner, where they would sit and read stories, play with puzzles, or simply chat. Murphy always lay in the middle, listening to the familiar sounds: John's laughter, Emily's gentle whispers, and David's familiar clucking of the tongue whenever he told old stories. No one had to say it, but on those afternoons, everyone understood that they were living in a precious, peaceful moment, surrounded by the presence of a loyal dog who had spent most of his life for them. And especially, whenever guests came over, John was always the one to take them to Murphy's Corner first. "This is Murphy," he would say with a serious tone, as if introducing a hero. "He saved our family." No matter how many times he'd said it, the boy's eyes would still shine as he recounted the story. As for Murphy, he would remain as usual, lying still, resting his head on his front paws, his eyes half closed, but perhaps his heart warming from the recognition, the love, and his integral place in the home. A large photo of Murphy, back when he was still strong, his ears standing upright, his eyes bright, hung just above his cushion. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. When that day arrived, the day Murphy no longer had the strength to open his eyes and look at the world again, this space would become a small memorial, not to mourn, but to honor, because that dog had lived a complete life, a life so full that its footprints would never fade from the memory of anyone who had stepped into this home. From the Murphy Corner in the living room, the warm light of late spring quietly streamed in, resting on the silver fur of the old dog who lay still with half-closed eyes. The breeze outside brought the fresh scent of cut grass, the chirping of sparrows by the window, and the hurried pitter-patter of little feet hurrying towards the rug. A new puppy had arrived, a little brown and white bundle, not yet 4 months old, named Buddy by John. From the very first day it entered the house, it had followed Murphy everywhere, clumsily bumping into his legs, licking his ears, and then trying to catch Murphy's tail, now gray with age. Murphy did not bark, nor did he push the puppy away. He simply lifted his head, gazing at Buddy with a look of calm understanding and quiet acceptance, a gaze that only one who had spent half his life as a guard could give to his successor. Murphy knew. His time was short. His legs grew weaker each morning. Breathing had become a heavy burden at times, but that did not make Murphy sad. His heart was still beating. But not for himself. His heart still beat for this family. David, Emily, John, and little Lily. Everyone Murphy had given his all to protect. And now he had someone to carry that responsibility forward. Buddy was mischievous, but very intelligent. Murphy couldn't teach him with words, but he had his own way. Through his eyes, his slow movements, and the habits deeply ingrained in the weary body of an old dog. Every morning, before anyone else woke up, Murphy would slowly drag himself to the front door and sit there for a few moments, looking out, and then glance at Buddy, as if telling him, "Do this every morning, to know that everything is safe." Buddy tried to imitate him, though sometimes he would fall asleep during his watch. Other times he would sneakily bite a slipper or suddenly bark loudly at his own reflection in the mirror. But Murphy never grew angry. He simply corrected everything gently, silently, with patience, a virtue that could not be taught in words. There were times when Murphy would growl when Buddy raced too quickly toward Lily's sleeping crib, not out of anger, but as a warning. The next time, Buddy remembered, he approached Lily more slowly, more gently, and only once settled by her side did he lie down. Murphy saw this and wagged his tail, the first time in many days. John was the one who witnessed it all. He brought his little notebook, murmuring to himself, "Murphy just growled, and Buddy stopped. Mom, I think Murphy's teaching him. He teaches with his eyes, not by shouting." Emily smiled softly, nodded, and then bent down to gently stroke Murphy. "Good job, Teacher Murphy," she said. David often stood at the door, watching the scene with mixed emotions. He had once thought Murphy was just an old dog, lying waiting for the inevitable end. But no, Murphy was still giving, though in a different, quieter, and nobler way. One afternoon, when Lily began to cry, Emily was busy in the kitchen. Murphy immediately wagged his tail 3 times on the floor, and Buddy understood, darting up to the bedroom. But instead of barking, Buddy sat next to the crib and gently licked Lily's tiny hand. Strangely, Lily stopped crying. When Emily ran to check, she froze. The sight of the little dog gently watching over her daughter's nap made her heart ache. She turned around, seeing Murphy sitting on the doorstep, content in the knowledge that his work had been passed on to the next generation. "You're passing on all the best of yourself to him, aren't you, Murphy?" Emily whispered, her eyes welling up. Murphy didn't respond, but the way he slowly wagged his tail, just enough to make the floorboards creak softly, that was the answer. That night, John added a new photo to the wall in the Murphy corner, a picture of Murphy and Buddy lying next to each other, both gazing out towards the gate. Beneath it, he wrote with a green marker, "Teacher and student, 2 guardians of our sleep." Buddy no longer ran around aimlessly. It began to learn how to quietly sit by the door every night. It learned to bark firmly, not to shout. It knew when to step back when John was upset, and when to approach when he was sad. All of these things Murphy didn't teach by scolding. He only repeated what he had done for John when he was young. And now, Buddy understood. Murphy didn't know how many more days he had left. But that didn't scare him, because now, every morning when he woke up, he still found the house peaceful, the children still laughing, David still walking out to the garden to water the plants, Emily still gently stroking his head, and there was a little puppy growing up each day, strong, affectionate, and full of protective instincts, a little replica of the Murphy from the past. When night fell, Murphy often lay near the window, Buddy beside him, their heads touching. Sometimes Buddy even rested a paw on Murphy's back without any response. Outside, the soft breeze whispered through the flower pots on the porch. Murphy closed his eyes. In the warm darkness of the house, he heard the steady breathing of John, the rustling movements of Lily, and the busy sounds of the kitchen where Emily was preparing an early breakfast. And his heart, though weary, still stirred with a rhythm, not for himself, but for this family, and for the little dog who was stepping into his paws, Buddy, the new gatekeeper of the house named Carter. On the last afternoon of spring, the sunlight stretched across the living room window, golden and gentle, as if it dared not touch anything. On the windowsill, where the light settled into a warm mist, Murphy lay curled up as usual. His coat, nearly entirely gray, was so thin that the light could pass through it, forming a soft glow on his back. Each time Murphy exhaled, Dust floated up and then settled again, in rhythm with his slow, steady breathing, like memories drifting around the house, clinging to every corner, every breath of time. In that quiet room, there was no more loud chatter, no more TV blaring, only the soft wind passing through the pots of plants outside the porch, and the rustling sound of John sitting on the carpet, carefully assembling the model he had left unfinished for so long. He no longer clutched his phone or immersed himself in games. The past few months, with Murphy as his guide, had taught him how to observe, how to listen, and most importantly, how to love through actions, not just words. John no longer needed anyone to remind him to check Murphy's water bowl, to make Murphy's bed, and every night he would gently touch the old dog's head to say goodnight. He had once wrongly blamed Murphy, once yelled harsh words in a fit of childish anger, but then he was the first to run out into the rain to find Murphy, the first to sob out an apology. And today, he sat quietly, drawing a picture of Murphy and Buddy beneath the tree, as if trying to hold on to something slowly fading into the sunlight. In the corner of the room, David set his teacup down on the table and quietly approached Murphy. He had learned not to overlook the small things. Before, he had thought that as long as he provided enough, he was a good father, a good man, the head of the family. But Murphy had taught him the opposite. True care was in the gentle bows, the looks back, the strokes at times when no one was paying attention. Murphy was the mirror of selfless dedication, unconditional love, and loyalty without promises. David sat down beside Murphy, his gaze softening. Murphy didn't open his eyes, only twitched his ear, seemingly accustomed to this step, this breath. David gently placed his hand on Murphy's head, running his fingers from the top down to his frail back. "You don't need to do anything more, Murphy," he whispered, his voice soft, like a prayer. "You've protected us your whole life." Emily stood in the kitchen, clearly hearing every word. She turned away, hiding her teary eyes behind the cupboard door. She had once seen Murphy as a nuisance, had once left him outside in the rain, had once ignored Murphy's instincts when Sarah first appeared. But now, Murphy was the reason her daughter was still safe, the reason her family understood each other better, and the reason their house still held an invisible yet indispensable light, the light of enduring love, quiet, unassuming, and not showy. Buddy lay next to Murphy, looking up and then gently nudging his head into the old mentor's leg. It still hadn't learned everything, but it had understood the most important thing. To protect is to love, and to love is to stay, by any means, in any circumstance. The Carter family's home no longer holds those empty silences it once did. The space has been filled with Lily's laughter, John's hurried footsteps, the sound of David's morning coffee dripping, and Emily's gentle lullabies. But at the heart of it all, there remains a place for Murphy. Not just a spot to lie down or a framed photograph, but a living, breathing part of the soul of this family. Time doesn't stop for anyone, and Murphy didn't fight it, but he had reached the full extent of his role. Not merely a pet, but a piece of the family's flesh and blood. A hero, a friend who never lied, never left, never loved less, even after being cast aside. That late afternoon, as the sun slowly retreated behind the branches of the trees in the yard, its final golden light still draped across Murphy's back. Gently, tenderly, like the hand of a father resting on the shoulder of his loyal child who had just completed the final task of his life. Murphy took a deep, long breath. He didn't need to open his eyes to know that all those he loved were here, right beside him, and would continue to live in the light he had guarded all his life. And so, with no bark, no sigh, Murphy, the silent guardian of the Carter family, quietly drifted into sleep, in the warmth of an afternoon, by the familiar windowsill, under the loving gaze of all those he had never left. Murphy's journey was not just one of protection, it was also a testament to enduring loyalty, unconditional empathy, and the fierce love that comes from a soul once wounded. Perhaps, sometimes, a dog is not merely a pet, but a teacher, a silent hero that steps into our lives only to change everything. Have you ever witnessed a moment when the love of a dog changed your perspective on life? Feel free to share your story in the comments below. If Murphy's story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and spread the good vibes. Subscribe to our channel to continue accompanying us on the next emotional journeys. Thank you for listening.